Dear colleagues, I would like to start by taking you to the South Indian kingdom of Ikeri, also known as Keladi, which was located in central Karnataka. The rulers of Ikeri, the Nayaka dynasty, were initially local governors of Vijayanagara, but when this empire disintegrated in the late 16th century, the Ikeri Nayakas slowly became autonomous. In September 1661, there was a succession to the throne in Ikeri because King Venkatappa Nayaka II died, and he was a brother of Ikeri's famous ruler Shivappa Nayaka, who had reigned before him. So this brother, he died, as you can read here, Venkatappa Nayaka II. This king, Venkatappa Nayaka, was succeeded by his nephew Bhadrappa Nayaka, who was the son of that famous earlier ruler Shivaji. The historical sources that have been studied so far for this succession are various dynastic chronicles composed at the Ikeri court itself, in Sanskrit or Kannada. One of them is the Kannada text Keladi Arasara Vamshafali, I hope I pronounced it correctly, which was written in the late 18th century. In the early 19th century, this chronicle was translated into English by the Brahmin assistance of the British surveyor Colin Mackenzie. Is what the Keladi Arasara Vamshafali has to say in its English translation about that succession in Ikeri in 1661. So what it says is, I quote, Venkatapati Nayak, the brother of Shivappa Nayak, was acknowledged at the Auramana, which means palace, of Bidunur, which is Bednur, the capital of Ikeri, and he assumed the government of all the kingdom. He maintained his nephew, Bhadrappa Nayak, that's the nephew I just mentioned, in an honorable manner, becoming his rank. Then the text continues. He, so that is the first ruler, the uncle, he governed his kingdom without dread of the wicked, from the Salivahan year 1583 of the cycle year Sarvari. So that is the Hindu calendar. It equals the year 1660. He's governed until the cycle year Plava, which is 1661. Bhadrappa Nayaka, the eldest son of Shivappa Nayaka, was then acknowledged in the kingdom. He governed mildly and reputably. End of the quote. So in this chronicle we have a rather brief description of this succession, and the text portrays it as a mostly harmonious, peaceful transition. King Venkatappa is said to have treated his nephew Bhadrappa Nayaka well, and was then succeeded by him, and this nephew was apparently a mild man with a good reputation. Largely similar versions of the account are found in two other local chronicles about the Ikeri Nayakas. There is the Sanskrit Shiva Tattva Ratnakara, and there's also the Kannada Keladenripa Vijayam, both composed in the 18th century, so quite a bit later than the actual events. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC in Dutch, also wrote a report about this succession, from Venkatappa Nayaka to Bhadrappa Nayaka. The VOC, or the Dutch, had trading posts in and near the Ikeri kingdom at the ports of Kundapura and Vengurla on the Kanara and Konkan coasts. There, the Dutch bought pepper and rice, and they also recorded all developments in the region that could influence their business. This is what the VOC wrote about the same succession in a letter from Vengurla on the 13th of May 1662, so only 8 months after the succession. And this is actually only one section of only one of the letters that concern this succession. This is of course in Old Dutch, but I have translated part of it as literally as possible. The letter says that the Dutch were informed, and here I will start quoting, how Venkatappa Nayak, so that is the first ruler, was killed by a general named Shivalingya with the help of Bhadrappa Nayaka, so that's the nephew I've been mentioning, the eldest son of the deceased Shivappa Nayak, and how the mentioned prince was raised to the throne in his father's place. This happened because that Venkatappa Nayak loved the single-headed reign too much, so he was a dictator, which not only made him forget to pay appropriate respect to the said prince and general, but moreover, he decided secretly to take Shivalingya's life, so that's the general, and Bhadrapanayaka's side, so he was actually planning to blind his nephew. But they, so that's the general and the nephew, observing matters were not right, wangled for so long that they found out about the secret, and seeing the approaching danger that was threatening them, they resolved to make a virtue out of necessity and let Ventapanayaka fall in the trap that was set for them. So, the Dutch letter continues. On September 8th, the aforesaid prince and general both provided with a good saber, without any retinue, but 2 or 3 trusted guards, moved in the morning at dawn to the palace of Ventapanayak, so the reigning king, whom they caught in his bedroom as he was waking up, accompanied by a chief counselor and a chamberlain. Grasping the betrayal, the king called for his handgun, but jumping to him, Shivalingya, that's the general, dealt Ventapanayak a blow on the head so heavy that he fell on the ground and vomited his soul right away. So he died. The counselor and the chamberlain, who tried to protect the king, were also hacked down. Seeing their intention accomplished as desired, they hastily commanded that the gates of the palace be closed and reinforced with trusted guards until order had been restored. End of quote. This and other VOC letters go on to explain that in fact order was not restored soon. The Ikari kingdom suffered from political instability for quite some time. And in fact, in an uproar in the capital, the new king, his nephew Bhadrapanayaka, almost lost his throne too. The kingdom-wide confusion also affected the trade of the Dutch. And for this reason, the VOC servants at Vengurla wrote about these developments in so much detail. They had to explain to their superiors why business in Ikari had not been good during the past months. From this Dutch account, we get an impression of the succession in Ikari in 1661 that is entirely different from what appears from the local chronicles, composed at the Ikari court itself. According to the VOC report, Venkatapanayaka II did not treat his nephew Bhadrapa with respect, not in an honorable manner, but actually showed him disrespect. Indeed, supposedly, the king intended to blind his nephew, and as a consequence, Bhadrapa is said to have murdered his uncle to take the throne for himself. This particular Dutch letter, 65 pages long, and also concerning many other matters, was shipped from the Dutch post at Vengurla to reach the VOC headquarters at Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta in Indonesia. In Batavia, where the letter reached in mid-1662, the letter was copied and forwarded to the Dutch Republic, where it arrived in 1663. There, it was bound in a thick volume with other documents received in that same year from VOC settlements all over Asia. In fact, 3 thick volumes were needed to bind together all VOC documents received in 1663 in the Dutch Republic from Asia. In previous decades, from the early 17th century onward, this number, the number of volumes, had varied between 2 and 8 volumes per year. But in the following years, until the late 18th century, the number of volumes with documents received from Asia would quickly grow and regularly exceed 30 or 40 thick volumes per year. By 1794, the vast archives of the VOC in the Netherlands included almost 3,000 thick volumes with documents shipped from Dutch settlements all over Asia and covering a period of almost 2 centuries. Placed in a row, like in a library, they stretch for almost half a kilometer, that is about 1/3 of a mile. These records concern all areas in Asia where the VOC was active, from Yemen and Iraq to Taiwan and Japan. But about 1/3 of these volumes, so about 1,000 of them, consist of documents received from what we now call India. The VOC itself didn't use the term India for what we now call India, but referred to 5 different Indian regions where it was active. These 5 areas were called Surat, which also covered Gujarat and the Delhi-Agra region, Malabar, stretching along the Kerala and Karnataka coasts, Coromandel, referring to most of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, Bengal, which included Bengal but also Bihar, and the fishery coast, which concerned the Tamil coast between Cape Comorin and Rameswaram, and which was administered from the Dutch settlements on Ceylon or Sri Lanka. These regional names did not refer to large territories ruled by the VOC, because the Dutch had hardly any territorial possessions in India. At most, they governed a few towns that they had conquered from the Portuguese, like Cochin, Tuticorin, and Nagapattinam. So these regional names, in fact, chiefly denote groups of small separate settlements, small separate trading posts, consisting of only a few buildings and at most a fort. Although the precise number has never been established, there were altogether at least 70, so 70 Dutch settlements all over India, mostly on the various coasts, but sometimes also in the interior, like Golconda, Ahmedabad, Patna, and Agra. From all these posts, the VOC conducted trade, but also reported on all sorts of local events and developments. So the Dutch did not only write about trade and shipping, but also about politics, war, geography, religion, all kinds of social aspects like jatis, nature, climate, languages, and so on. For instance, if a battle was fought between some Indian kingdoms, and weavers and other craftsmen had to flee, this influenced the Dutch business. And so the VOC would report about the size and the composition of the Indian armies employed, the weapons they used, and which military tactics were employed. If the VOC wished to conclude treaties with Indian rulers to get permission to conduct trade, it had to send ambassadors to the courts in question. And it had to know which court officials were the most powerful, and what sort of gifts had to be given to them, and what kind of court ceremonial had to be followed. So basically, all things that somehow might affect the VOC's business, and also lots of other matters, were recorded year after year by the Dutch at their dozens of settlements in India. And all these documents were kept in India itself, but many of them were also copied and sent to Batavia and to the Dutch Republic. So, what happened to all these letters, reports, and other Dutch papers? Much of it has disappeared, but much of it has also survived. I already showed you some of the documents kept in the National Archives in the Netherlands. All VOC records copied and sent from India and later received in the Dutch Republic are still available. About 1,000 thick volumes, each with dozens of documents. But of course, the 5 VOC regions in India that I just mentioned also kept their own archives. And actually, only part of those regional VOC records was copied and shipped overseas. Other parts were not considered important enough to be sent to the higher ranks of the company in Batavia and the Dutch Republic. These were mostly documents that dealt with matters of a more day-to-day and local nature. So the question is, what is left of those regional Dutch archives that were kept in India? Here the answer is a little bit less positive, unfortunately. The VOC records of most regions have largely disappeared. Nobody knows when, where, or how. Some of the records of the fishery coast are still found among the VOC's Ceylon archives, which are presently kept in Colombo. But it is only the archives of the VOC region Malabar that are still largely existing. They are now kept in the Tamil Nadu archives in Chennai, where they are known as the Dutch records. So, if you use VOC sources for the history of Malabar, which is of course mostly present-day Kerala, you have double luck. Because then you can study both the documents sent from Malabar to the Dutch Republic, now in the National Archives in the Netherlands, and the documents kept in Malabar itself, now stored in Chennai. In the VOC archives of Malabar itself, those in Chennai, you find several records that were not copied and shipped overseas, so they are unique. To give you a few examples, letters received by the VOC in Malabar from Indians, like kings and merchants, were often written in Indian languages. Only Dutch translations of these documents were sent to the Dutch Republic, because there nobody was able to read the originals, of course. So here you see an example of a document from Ikeri, which is written in Canada. This was obviously not shipped to the Netherlands because no one could read it there. So you can only find it in one of those local archives. And here's another example. I don't know if it's clear, but at the bottom of the slide, you see a kind of palm leaf record, which is bound with the Dutch records. It is written in Malayalam. So these are two examples of papers that were not shipped to the Netherlands. Also, other records concerning such local affairs, as for instance, personal slaves by Dutchmen, kept by Dutchmen in Cochin, the Dutch headquarters of Malabar, were not sent elsewhere. And so you can only study a subject like that in the VOC records in Chennai. By the way, small sections of the Dutch archives of the regions Surat, Bengal and Coromandel also still exist. Most of them, but it's not much unfortunately, are kept in Chennai too, and a few VOC records are even found in the West Bengal State Archives in Calcutta. Actually, we only recently discovered them. Now, if you are a historian and you want to work with Dutch records on India, how do you know where to start searching? How can you access these archives? But hopefully I can convince you these records are well described and are quite easily accessible. First, there are, of course, regular inventories and catalogs of all the VOC archives still available worldwide. And all these inventories, about 125 in total, so that is also 125 collections, have been put online. And here you see part of the internet page that has links to all these inventories, just to give you an example. And if you click on the link of, for example, the inventory of the Dutch records at the Tamil Nadu archives, and you start scrolling, you might end up here. This particular section concerns letters received by the VOC in Malabar from Indian parties. But there is much more, of course, because documents concerning more than one topic have general descriptions, like simply letters from Masulipatam to Batavia. So they may deal with lots of subjects, but also Golconda. Besides these inventories and databases, all Dutch sources concerning India, including texts, maps, drawings and paintings, have been described in 3 archival guidebooks that have been published by Manohar publishers in Delhi. Here you see the 3 covers. Volume 1 and 2 cover Dutch materials in the Netherlands. Volume 3 concerns Dutch materials kept in the rest of the world, including those in India. But not only are all these Dutch sources for Indian history well catalogued and described, the records themselves are also becoming more and more accessible. All the Dutch records in Chennai that are unique, so those of which no copies were shipped to the Dutch Republic at that time, have been put on the internet, so everyone can see them. This, for example, is an online scan from a Dutch volume listing the lands owned by the inhabitants of the Coromandel port of Pulicat in 1820. Also, the entire VOC archives of the Netherlands, including those 1,000 volumes with documents received from India, are now being put online. In other words, nobody needs to make expensive research trips anymore to the Netherlands to see these documents. You can consult them just from behind your computer. And the best news is, most of these Dutch sources on India have not yet been researched by anyone, since they were written between 200 and 400 years ago. But there's also some bad news. You have to learn Dutch, and you have to learn Old Dutch handwriting. But this can also be done on the internet. I will give another example, and this is where I will conclude, from my own research. Because I am studying court politics and court culture in the successor states of Vijayanagara. Not only Ikeri, which I already talked about, but also Madurai, Tanjavur, and Ramnath. So here you see the kingdoms that I'm working on. One of the things I look at are the courtiers or officials at these courts. I am interested in the various positions that existed at the courts, which of these were most powerful, and if this perhaps changed over time. As with the succession to the throne in Ikeri in 1661, research on these courtiers has so far been based almost entirely on local sources, inscriptions, literary texts, and a few statues and paintings. In these studies, for all courts it has been concluded that it was generally the Pradhani, or prime minister, who was most important. The next most powerful person was usually the Dalavai, or general, while the Rayasam, or secretary, often came third. Well, Dutch records give a rather different impression if we consider who were the most influential courtiers according to the VOC. In their reports of embassies to these courts, for example, the Dutch specified exactly to which courtiers they presented what gifts and how much these costed. Of course, the VOC would give the most valuable gifts to the people whom they thought were the most powerful at the court and could best serve Dutch interests. So here you see an overview of the distribution of gifts at 7 Dutch embassies to the Nayakas of Madurai between 1668 and 1731. Of course, the ruler would always receive the most presents and the most expensive presents, no matter how powerful he, or sometimes a she, actually was. But for other prominent people at the court, the distribution of the most valuable gifts changed every time. So we note in these 2 examples that people in all sorts of functions could be actually the most powerful courtiers, and that also the importance of those functions changed over time. So again, Dutch sources provide information that is different from what local sources say. Of course, these distributions of gifts only show the balance of power as it was perceived by the Dutch. Naturally, their information about the courts was limited, biased, and perhaps sometimes even deliberately distorted. But at the same time, the numerous complaints that the VOC received from the courts about the gifts almost never concerned their distribution. There were complaints about the volume, type, and number of gifts, and the courtiers always wanted more. But it happened only seldom that the VOC was asked to change its priority of presents for the various courtiers. So it could be concluded that the Dutch records may not give a perfect or complete picture of the balance of power at these courts, but these sources have certainly something to contribute to what we already know. The same goes for the VOC report about the succession to the throne in Ikeri. We don't know if all these bloody details in the Dutch reports are entirely correct, but it seems at least certain that this succession was not as peaceful as the chronicle Keladi Arasara from Shavali would lead us to believe. Whereas the Dutch sources may be somewhat misinformed, Indian sources, of course, have their own peculiarities. That's a hard word. The Keladi Arasa Vamshavali, for example, was composed by a court poet patronized by a descendant of this nephew, Badrapa Nayaka, the nephew who, according to the Dutch, murdered his uncle. Now I read the last page. It seems logical that this descendant would not want this text to mention how his ancestor in fact killed a relative, because that would suggest that this branch of the royal family actually gained the throne by unlawful means. So it should not surprise that the Dutch account refers to violence, whereas the local chronicle does not. So, of course, all sources have their own agenda, bias, shortcomings, and so on. As for the Dutch records, whether they confirm or contradict the existing historiography, they always have much to add, which gives us a more balanced view of the past. I hope I have been able to convince you of the value of Dutch sources for Indian history and how extensive and accessible these materials are. If I did not convince you yet, then hopefully the following presentations will. Thank you.